Reaching from way down here. From way down here.
Welcome to Thread, a podcast designed to explore God's story and lead you into a full life in Christ.
Thank you for joining us in this conversation, co-hosted by myself, Hannah Desouza, and Dr. David Pocta.
Though I'm way down here, I get a better view of this boundless world that I'm going to.
Hello, everyone. I am Hannah Desouza,
And I am Dr. David Pocta.
and we would like to welcome you to Thread, to episode 0, actually, of Thread, a podcast about finding your place in God's story.
Our goal with this episode 0 is to help orient you to Thread, what it's about, our approach, how it will work. We also want you to get to know us a little bit as we begin this journey. So, Hannah, let's start with you. Tell us your story.
So I grew up in London, if you couldn't tell from my accent. I'm from the UK. My dad is Caribbean and Malaysian, and my mum is English, but I was raised in East London. My parents actually were both ministers. This year, they just came out of the ministry. Now my dad is a personal trainer, and my mum teaches the piano and guitar full time. But my entire upbringing, they were ministers, and there's a wonderful side to that. I think the Christian principles that me and my siblings were raised with, and just the importance that the Bible had in our home. But for me, faith was something from a young age that I did not want to just inherit, but was something I really felt like I wanted to study out for myself, to figure out if I believed it even, and whether this was going to be a part of my life too. And I was persuaded at the age of 15 and was baptized. I've always loved reading, and I went on to study actually English literature at King's College in London, and then I went to Oxford to get a master's in Victorian literature.
Nice.
But the idea of the Bible being a book was always something that drew me in, actually, that God had chosen that as the method through which to communicate to mankind, and that always fascinated me, as well as the character of Jesus. I felt like he was unlike anyone I knew, and so countercultural that he could not have been created by men. But yeah, I made that decision at 15, and I believe I knew enough at the time to commit to it, but there's only so much you know at that age about what that commitment will look like for the rest of your life and in all seasons. And in many ways, I actually feel like I've gone through a series of reconversions even. Like, I didn't know what it would look like to be a Christian in university at 15, or again, when I've graduated at 21 or at 25, or even now as I'm approaching 30, what does that look like for me now in this season to be walking with God? So definitely is a journey and a story, but helping other people navigate their spiritual journey and find faith has always been something I've found very rewarding. So after graduating, I actually spent a few years in Boston, where I worked for a church out there as a young professionals and campus minister. So during that season, I felt like a door had closed, but another door weirdly opened when I was made aware of like a mission team going out to Eastern Europe, to Moldova, actually. And that had always been a dream, to do missionary work and be immersed in another culture and bring faith to another country. So I seized the opportunity, and that was where I was last year in Moldova, where I worked for a small church, and we lived actually about an hour away from the Ukrainian border. So when the war broke out in February of last year, 2022, that was a really intense season where I ended up kind of being ministry with refugees, as a lot of them, like hundreds, it felt like, lived with us actually in the building where we were staying. So it was a scary time, rewarding, definitely stretched me in ways I never imagined I'd be stretched, but very grateful for what I learned in that time. And actually, while I was over there, I applied to Harvard to study theology. That had been another lifelong dream, to go deeper in my education, in my knowledge of theology and religion. And actually, while I lived in Boston, I'd attended the open day at Harvard Divinity School for 3 years in a row because I'd felt called in some way, particularly to the school because it was diverse. I liked the pluralist nature of it. It intrigued me. I didn't feel like I'd been exposed to much dialogue with other traditions and faith groups in my upbringing. So now I'm in classes with everyone from atheists to monks, learning a lot. I've done my fair share of deconstructing. I know that's a buzzword right now, but definitely has been a part of my journey. But I think I'm in a place where I'm figuring out, what does reconstruction look like, and what not what not to do, but what to do as well. As well as making sure, even when I'm studying, that what I'm learning is not just cerebral and kind of head knowledge, but how to translate that to heart knowledge and lived spirituality. So I'm looking forward actually to this journey, even with this podcast. And I feel like I'm going to be learning a lot as we do them, with just tools, and particularly to do with spirituality, how I'm going to apply that. I know I'm going to be able to apply that to my own walk with God. So yeah, that's a bit of my story, definitely forming. What about you, Dave? I know you kind of came to spirituality later on in your kind of academic journey and life. And what has that journey been like for you up until that point and beyond?
Yeah, certainly the study of spirituality has been more recent, but I was fortunate to pursue my own spirituality as a young person. I was very blessed to grow up in a very loving Catholic family. We went to church every Sunday, even on vacation. But as someone who lives life wholeheartedly, it didn't take long before, in my teen and early campus years, I found myself building really destructive habits: drugs, alcohol, unhealthy relationships. And I met a group of Christians who really taught me the Bible, and that community reshaped me. We're going to talk in one of our episodes about metanoia, this, complete transformation of the way we see the world. And that community helped me to do that, to really have that conversion and transformation experience. They also helped me to rebuild healthy commitments in my life, healthy relationships, healthy practices. So that was back in 1990. I met my wife when I was a student at the University of Minnesota. Beth and I got married in 1992. And really from the beginning felt called, both of us together felt this calling. And when I look at the 3 decades I've been married, I actually think I would put my spiritual life now in these kind of 3 major callings. After becoming a Christian, that first calling was to ministry. And Beth and I worked in ministry together for 26 years, in Minnesota, in Chicago, in South Africa, and in San Antonio. And that led, that part of that was our second calling. That whole move to South Africa really felt like a Spirit's call for us. We moved with our 12 and 14-year-old daughters to the other side of the world. And it was just challenging and rich and fascinating. So Beth and I, our area of expertise or specialty in ministry was always youth and family. We did it for 17 years of our 26 years. A lot of that was spent with teens and their families and working with family dynamics. But when we came back to the U.S., a couple years of traveling back and forth and entering these late 40s in my life, that stage of life, led to kind of a different kind of calling. There was I think now I would call it a spiritual midlife crisis back in 2016. Mm-hmm. And you can use the different metaphors. I hit a wall, I ran out of gas. But something really needed to change. And it was actually during that time of discernment, reflection, that I felt called to deeper study. So I started searching for a PhD program that taught spirituality, and happened to find the top school in North America that actually had a devoted PhD program to spirituality. Was 10 miles from my house. I don't know how many kilometers that is, Anna. Anyway, 10 miles.
Me neither.
Okay. But it was really special. I got to study with who's become a great mentor and friend, Father Ron Rollheiser. I spent 5.5 years full time just pursuing this PhD, and successfully defended my dissertation this November of 2022. Yay. So it's not even been a year at the time we're recording this. I've had a lot of people ask me what my dissertation was about. It was called Lost at Sea, How the Journey of Wandering Christians in Times of Wilderness Reveals the Need for a Reimagined Church Culture in Protestant Evangelicalism. So in other words, I studied the struggle. I studied the wilderness. A lot of it was for myself to just make sense of it all. So now I have a PhD in spirituality, and I'm currently I kind of have a job and a part-time job. So I now have the pleasure and honor of being the director of the Institute for the Study of Contemporary Spirituality at the school that I studied at Oblate, which is a wonderful opportunity to be involved with the faculty and the academic world. And I'm also working as the executive director of this nonprofit that we have called the Disciple Center for Education that's working with churches to help advance education. So that's where I'm coming from. And my hope is this podcast is really an opportunity for you and I to share our journeys with our listeners and the things we've learned and the deconstruction and the reconstruction and all the things that we're processing ourselves.
I think a question I imagine a lot of people might have is, why a podcast? There are many podcasts out there. I know I personally tune into many. What would you say, Dave, is going to be different about Thread? And how do you see it maybe meeting a need that is not already out there?
Yeah, our approach will be a little bit different than I think a lot of podcasts out there, which tend to focus either on, strictly scripture or cultural conversations. Our approach is going to be that of story and spirituality. And we chose Thread because it works in a few important ways to that end, both as a verb and a noun. So we're really interested here in the meta narrative that threads through the Bible. And this idea that I think is at the center of that, which is God's love and desire to have an intimate relationship with us. So I want us to be interested in this podcast in how our lives are meant to be shaped and shared in that thread, which really talks about our spirituality. So a lot of times, and we'll get into a whole podcast, I think it's going to be in episode 3, where we talk specifically about what is spirituality. But very simply, if theology focuses on the rules to the game, spirituality focuses on how we play the game. And so that's what we want to talk about, how we think about our life as it's oriented around God and what that means for us. So currently we have a plan for Thread to be a 3-year journey. We'll see what happens with all that. It'll be a year with Yahweh and the people in the Old Testament. It'll be a year with Jesus and the people in the Gospels, and it'll be a year with the Spirit and the people in the rest of the New Testament.
So just as a disclaimer for those listening, the name Thread was chosen at the start of this year. We had a logo was designed. I think we'd already even recorded 4 episodes before we discovered this week, and we're recording this early July 2023, that Instagram or Mark Zuckerberg released this new app, Threads. So I promise we did not steal his idea. This isn't plagiarism.
Exactly. We were clearly onto something. So someone needs to tell Meta and Mark Zuckerberg that we had it first.
Exactly. Great minds think alike. That's how I'm going to view that.
There you go.
But you'll be able to access Thread on both video and audio platforms. So wherever you listen to your podcasts. And for the video version, you can find us on YouTube. And the social media handle will be the same for all the platforms. It's at Thread Podcast. And that's YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook.
Yeah. So the value of watching the video is that we will have slides and scriptures and quotes that people will be able to see, and sometimes charts and graphs. So we will try to link all those important resources in the show notes, but where possible, I think the video is helpful to watch. Plus, they get to see you, Hannah.
Oh, no. Yeah, actually, you can see our changing backgrounds as well.
That's
I'm going to be in
right.
various places, so... And right now our plan, again, don't hold us to these things, but we're intending is to release an episode each week. And our first 4 episodes will be foundational to the series. They're going to kind of be our introductory episodes. And we're going to discuss in those our image of God, why story and the importance of story, why spirituality, and then the story of our faith, that meta-narrative. So these episodes are going to give some definitions and context, so we definitely would recommend looking at those and before jumping into the rest, just understand where we're coming from.
Yeah, our hope is that you, the listeners, will see and understand God's love and beauty surrounding you, weaving you into this story, especially through the trials and suffering that we all go through. So we're coming at this story from the big picture. We want to step back and not get caught up in too much detail, but rather see and remain seeing this big picture of how God loves us, wants to be present in our lives. It's kind of like using Google Earth. I don't know if you ever did that, Hannah. When Google Earth first came out, I had a lot of fun with it, just playing around, zoning in on my house.
Yep.
And then when you pan back and you get to see the big picture, I imagine that's really what we want to keep in view of this podcast.
Yeah, that idea of zooming out to get that big picture, I think, is such an important one, because it is easy to get lost in the details. And actually, when you first told me you'd thought of this name, Thread, for the podcast, the first thing that actually came to mind for me was a song from The Prince of Egypt, which was a movie I played a lot growing up on loop. And the song, this lyric is in the song Through Heaven's Eyes. And the verse that came to mind was this one. It says, "A single thread in a tapestry, though its color brightly shines, can never see its purpose in the pattern of the grand design." And I love that, because I think our lives as individuals and collectively can be like these threads woven together that make up a bigger picture, or this bigger tapestry. And I actually got into embroidery during COVID. Actually, this wasn't in the script. I have one right here because I'm working on it.
Nice.
So for those of video, you can see this embroidery. When I get back to Boston, you'll hopefully see the finished product in my new apartment. But when you're embroidering, the back of it is really messy. There are threads everywhere. They're kind of tangled and different colors, and it's the part that you don't want people to see when you hang it up. But as you kind of continue, the picture becomes clearer, and those individual threads start to make sense when you see the final pattern and design. And I think that is such a great metaphor for life, kind of just that speaks to the messiness of our journeys individually and collectively, and how it can feel confusing, and when you kind of lose sense of what is the bigger picture is and what it will look like when you're in it. But then you do, when you're able to zoom out, get a sense of how this is what was being formed all along. And that refrain in the song is, "You must look at your life through heaven's eyes." So yeah, I'm excited even for us to get to do that, to get to zoom out and see that bigger picture through this podcast.
Such a great analogy. And I think that's where our hope is our listeners will understand, as they feel maybe we look too much at the back and we only see the messy part of that embroidery, but to flip it over and see what's God actually doing in our life. Where is he leading us? What kind of picture is he painting? I love that. It's a beautiful image. So Hannah, you and I know, are really excited about this journey and where it takes us. Our hope is for our listeners that you will equally be excited about this journey. So thank you for listening in on episode 0. And we hope you join us on this 3-year plan with us, and we will see you next week. Thank you for joining this Thread conversation.
We're more than a podcast. Check out threadpodcast.org for more immersive content.
Though I'm way down here, I get a better view of this boundless world